Shavuot Tov, good evening to everyone. Thank you so much for being here on this Erev Selichot program. Each year we convene a community conversation in an effort to learn from one another. Rather than the normal frontal teaching and the teachings of our rabbis, our visiting speakers, and our scholars, we take advantage of the opportunity to recognize that we have teachers all around us. There are members of our community who seem ordinary, but have lived extraordinary lives, extraordinary experiences, and from whom there is so much to learn. We've had incredible community conversations over the years on topics such as finding meaning in prayer and modesty, how to overcome adversity, and a range of different topics. You can watch them online on the Shul's website. And tonight we're very excited to be able to have a conversation on a very personal and a very sensitive topic, and that is two individuals who experienced things in their lives in which their lives changed in a moment forever. Very different events with very different consequences, but each have their own story, and they're stories that are extremely worthwhile to hear and to learn from. So what we're going to do this evening, first of all, I want to welcome our panelists, Susan Mustafi and Danielle Miller, and express our gratitude to them for agreeing to do this. As you'll learn in a moment, these stories are highly personal, they're highly sensitive, and it takes great courage, and I imagine it revisits a lot of pain and trauma to retell the story again and again. So we don't take lightly your willingness to be here with us this evening. We're deeply appreciative, and we thank you for the opportunity to learn from you. What we're going to do is I'm going to ask each of them to tell their story, take a few minutes, and after they share their story, the event that changed their lives forever, then we'll be able to begin our conversation, ask some questions. I'll try to moderate some what I think is on people's minds, and then we'll open it up to the floor. We'll open it up to questions from the floor. So again, thank you all for being here this evening. Thank you very much to our panelists. We offered ladies first, but Susan deferred to Danielle, who's going to tell his story. Danielle, thank you.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be back in Boca. For those who don't know, I lived here for many years. Fortunately and unfortunately, I had reason to move, and it's a pleasure to be back. My story happened on September 4th, 1997, and I'd like to begin by giving a little bit of context and background to where I was at that point in my life, so the effect of how my life really did change in an instant could fully be felt. At that time, I had just graduated high school. My father, Rabbi Miller, was the head of the kollel here for many years, and principal and in Miami Beach and in education for many years. But at that time, I personally, and I had the most wonderful childhood and the most wonderful upbringing, but for different reasons, at that point in my life, I wasn't particularly religious. I wasn't Shomer Shabbos, I wasn't kosher, I was a typical rebellious teenager. And at that exact moment in my life, and again, I share this as a personal part of my life, and it's very sensitive, but it is important to understand the effect of what happened. My parents and I were not speaking at that time, and they had sent me to Israel and said if I wanted to go, I was on my own. And I went to Israel literally with $200 in my pocket. I was accepted to a yeshiva, Reshis Yerushalayim. I was planning on attending until they kicked me out for not paying tuition. And that was basically where my life was. I arrived to Israel on September 4th, on September 3rd, really, the evening before. And I settled into my yeshiva the morning of September 4th. I dusted off my tefillin, went down to the kotel, and really had a special davening at Vasikin in the morning. And I really went up to the kotel and I prayed to God and I said, God, please, I'm here, I'm trying, I need a path, I need to meet somebody who can show me what my family, what so many people before me sees as the beautiful way of the Torah. I didn't realize that he would answer me only really a few hours later in that afternoon. Two of my friends who I had just met that day decided to have lunch on Ben Yehuda Street. For those who haven't been to Israel or don't know, Ben Yehuda was at that time a very, very crowded pedestrian mall. Lots of stores with souvenirs, school supplies, anything you could think of, gifts, restaurants. And that day was no exception. It was particularly crowded. It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We sat down to have a drink, to get some lunch. And we brought the drink to make a toast, and the toast was a little different than my prayer in the morning. It was more of, let me have a lot of fun on Ben Yehuda that year, let me meet a lot of girls, do a lot of whatever. But we didn't have a chance to bring those glasses together. Because as we did, 3 other people also decided to go to Ben Yehuda that day, but with very different purposes. They said goodbye to their families, they strapped themselves with explosives, filled up briefcases full of shrapnel, rusty nails and bolts, and placed themselves at 3 different areas on Ben Yehuda Street. The first bomber placed himself about 5 feet to my right. The second one right across the street from me. And when I say right across the street, it's across the pedestrian mall about 10 feet in front of me. And the third one up the street at Cafe Atara, a very popular cafe at that time. As we brought our glasses together, the first bomber blew himself up to my right. I was seated directly facing, but the force of the blast forced me to my left in my chair. The first moment that this happens, I really had no idea what was happening or what was I experiencing. I thought that I had brought the glass too hard on the toast and I had broken the glass, and that's why my glass in my hand was bleeding. So I turned back to my friends, embarrassed that I had just done that, but they were nowhere to be seen. The friend who was sitting in front of me, A.B. Mendelson, had flown 10 feet in the air to the left and was on the ground, and Avi Alicious, I couldn't find him anywhere. As I looked forward, I looked into the eyes of a man and heard him murmur some words that I later were known to me. He was murmuring Allahu Akbar, and the second bomber exploded right in front of my face. And I have to tell you, watching somebody explode is something that I can never ever forget. No matter how much therapy and how many times you talk about it, it's something that still resonates every night when I go to sleep and every morning when I wake up. At that moment, then, I finally realized what was happening. So I ran inside the cafe that was now, the glass doors that were right in front of me were now shattered. The waitress that had just served me was screaming and crying to call the police. At that point, the pain settled in. I remember sitting there thinking that I didn't know who would be able to find me, who would come in. I was sitting there bleeding. The khaki pants I was wearing were now all red. I thought this was it. This was my last moment. So I remember thinking in my head that if I could just have one more second to tell my parents that I'm sorry, or to tell my parents how much I care for them or love them and how much I regret everything that I did to them. But at that moment, a volunteer Israeli EMT came in, and let me tell you, at that moment, the third bomb went off up the street. So I tell you something about Israelis, volunteer EMTs, they're running into danger. They have no idea how many bombs there are, how many people are going to be hurt. They just come and run, and they're volunteers, lawyers, accountants, doesn't matter. The guy came in and picked me up and carried me outside. At that moment, they wrapped me up, took off all of my clothing, wherever I was bleeding, wrapped me up and took me to the hospital. I had permanent nerve damage in both my leg and arm. I had glass in my eye that had to be removed a week later. Maybe I'll get into more details about the different injuries and the different effects and miracles that happened. But thank God I'm here today and I could be walking around and nobody would have any idea that anything happened. My friend Avi Alicious had open heart surgery on the spot that day because he had a piece of shrapnel resting on his heart that if it was over an inch he would be instantly killed. A.B. Mendelson had to go home to get shrapnel removed from the back of his head. But all 3 of us are alive by some miracle and grace of God, and that's basically my story.
Thank you so much. Amazing story. We have a lot of questions, a lot of follow-up. We'll come back to in a moment. And now, again, we're grateful to Susan for sharing her story.
Shabbat Tov. Shabbat Tov. I'm very honored to be here. Thank you. My story begins I'll start on March 12th, 2010. I was married to a wonderful man. His name was Ovadia Mutsafi. He was a charming, handsome, wonderful husband and father. We were preparing ourselves to make Aliyah, to move to Israel. We were very happily married, and we were living in Teaneck, New Jersey. I sort of considered myself living in a way like a fairy tale life. You know, I'd never really seen any sort of pain or hurt. I felt very protected by my husband. I have 4 beautiful children. I lived in a beautiful house. We were really excited to be moving to Israel. Life was really, really good. And on March 13, 2010, it was a very stormy day. And my late husband was very involved with the Sephardic shul. And it was a really, really bad storm. And, you know, we lived very close to the shul. And, you know, of course, he would always be the first one there to be davening and the last one to leave. And, you know, most people showed up to shul that day as well as he did. And I sat there with, you know, I had the Havdalah candle ready and a cup of tea waiting for him. And that night, in that storm, you know, it was getting late. And he liked to, you know, schmooze with everybody, so it wasn't really unusual. But I had a really bad feeling. And then, you know, I sort of started to panic, and then I saw a lot of fire trucks. It was about 200 feet from my home. And you know, you always worry that the worst thing is going to happen, but it never does. And, you know, I just had this awful, awful feeling. And I remember running outside. There was electric wires everywhere. The storm was really bad. And a police officer started screaming at me to get back in the house. We're in a state of emergency. And I just remember feeling panicked, like I knew instinctually something was really wrong. And I started calling the hospitals and calling the police, and nothing, you know, was happening. And I called some of my friends to come, please, something's wrong, you know, Obadiah's not here. And my girlfriend came over, and you can't believe something really happens. And, you know, a rabbi had come to my door and said, you know, was your husband wearing, you know, a black jacket? And I said, yeah, where is he? Do you know where he is? And then he said, you know, who's your rabbi? And it didn't hit me. And then maybe about 20 minutes later, my rabbi came to my door, and he didn't say a word, he just looked at me. And my girlfriend was there, and my kids were there, just screaming, Abba, Abba. And you're like just complete shock that, no, this can't be happening. And, but all I could think about was, you know, like how am I going to move forward? What's going to happen to my kids? And, but also all I could think about was that I needed to get him buried really, really fast. I knew that the quicker he was buried, it was better for his neshama. And he was Israeli, and I wanted him buried in Israel. So all my attention kind of went to, like, who's watching him? How do we take care of him? And 2 of my kids didn't. They said, where do you want to bury him? And I said, we need to get him buried there. We tried to bury him where his parents. And the family in Israel said, you can't. It's all taken up. And we never sort of talked about it, like where we would go. Sorry. But a lot of miracles that I could kind of go into that kind of led up to actually how we got into Israel were from people that I had met before. My kids didn't have passports. Miracles happened to get them that passports. Angels kept coming in by means of people that I believe were sent from Hashem to get us through it. We ended up getting him buried in Israel. And it was completely shocking. We didn't have life insurance. I had almost a $7,000 a month mortgage. I didn't have a job at that point. We had some savings. I have 4 babies looking at me like, what are we going to do? He had a business in Manhattan that was like $10,000 a month in rent that I had no idea how to run. And everyone was looking to me for answers. And my husband was my best friend, and he was my life. He took care of everything. So I was left to sort of, what do I do first? And we ended up getting him buried in Israel. And I remember waking up that morning and I forgot where I was, and I thought it was all just a really bad dream. And I was very fortunate that we had some friends that got us to see Rabbi Kanievsky, and I met the Rebbetzin, and she held my hand, and she assured me that Ovadia was going to be helping me and helping my children from Shemayim. And I really believed it. And my boys got a blessing from the Rav. And I felt an overwhelming sense of that Hashem was with us. And I felt very close to Hashem. And I knew that He was holding my hand through all of this. And we returned from Israel, and we sat Shiva, and the outpouring of love from the Tina community was unbelievable. And there were so many people, strangers, who really helped myself, my children. And, it reached a point, I think, for me, my turning point was my daughter was going to Yad. She was about 5 years old. I don't think I had showered like a month, and I had no makeup on, and I was really not looking well. And she said, "Mommy, please don't come to school again." And I don't know, that hearing that, I said, you got to get yourself together, Susan. And your kids need you. You got to pull it together, and you have to be strong, and you have to move on, because they're looking to me, to lead them. So I made a conscious choice at that point, from that point on, that I was going to get dressed every day, and I was going to put a smile on my face. My late husband was probably the most positive person I'd ever met, that anyone had ever met. Even if he had a bad day at work and he made no money, I'd say, how was your day? And he'd always say, Baruch Hashem. And I'd say, Baruch Hashem, you made money, or Baruch Hashem that, you're happy? What is it? He's like, I'm happy and I'm alive and I love you, and okay, Baruch Hashem. And he really, was never depressed. He was always happy. He always looked at everything in a positive way. And he infused that in me and in my children. And I never realized how important that was until when you go through something like this, to see the good and to see the positive in things. And I realized that, I had a choice. Either I could, lie in bed and be depressed and have everybody depend on everybody and wallow in my sorrows, or pick myself up and rebuild our lives.
I think we probably should have put tissues on every chair in here tonight. 2 incredible stories, and I'm sure we're all flooded with so many questions and so much follow-up and so much we want to learn from both of you. But we're going to come back to Danielle. You shared that your relationship with God and some relationship with family was somewhat strained before you went to Israel that day. How did that experience change the way you look at the world, change the way you look at family? Since the way you described yourself going to Israel, you've given the Daf Yomi in our community, you've given Shiurim in our community, and obviously you're living a very different life now than the trajectory that you were on then. So how did that experience change you, and how did it inspire you?
Well, that's a very loaded question. The immediate after effect is not what you would think. I've heard stories of people who weren't religious, got into these situations, and all of a sudden, the next day they're following all 613 mitzvahs and the rest of their life. it wasn't necessarily like that for me. I always took a more measured approach to things, I think. And to answer the immediate question of my family, I went from not speaking to my parents to, when my father heard, he was principal of Hebrew Academy at the time, so when he heard of the attack, he heard it as a principal, and the candidate who was a principal here, was working there at the time, came up to him and told him that there was a bombing on Ben Yehuda Street, and we're going to say Selichot with the whole school. We're going to have an assembly. So he was teaching at the time, so immediately he thought, my son is there, but they didn't tell me anything, so he's probably okay. But then they came up to his room again a few minutes later, and immediately he knew that something had happened. They wouldn't disturb his class again for any other reason. And he said that the long hallway that they walked him down, for those 5 seconds or a minute long that they were going to take him into the office, he had thought that they were going to tell him that I had died. So you go from one moment to, not speaking and thinking and doing, to thinking that you might have ended things on a very terrible note. So in regards to family, immediately my parents were there the next day. We still had a lot of ups and downs, and I had wanted to go to Israel, and they had wanted me to go to Israel on my own terms, not to go on their terms anymore, or for me to think about it in my own way. So we continued in that path, regardless of what happened. I had to do things on my own and without their guidance or their involvement, for good things. In regards to religion, it took time. There's ups and downs. There's moments where you're really angry at God because I couldn't walk for 6 months. The streets of the old city, as you know, are all cobblestone, and I had to be pushed around in a wheelchair for a month and a half, walk around in a cane for 3-4 months, and it was extremely painful and extremely difficult to go anywhere and to do anything. So you wake up and you're angry at God for that, and then there are moments where you think you're so happy that you're alive and well, and considering how close you were that everything turned out the way it did. So it took time, but one thing that definitely stuck with me is that you cannot go through life anymore as a teenager. You can't go through life as, I own the world and I know everything. Immediately I realized I didn't know anything, and I needed to open up my eyes, open up my ears to whoever was willing to teach me. And that is what I did. I went in with a faith in that whoever I would speak to and whoever would become my mentor, that no matter what he did tell me and no matter what he said, I would not argue, and I would do whatever he said. And I would do that for a few months, and if it turned out okay, and I liked what he had to say, and it felt like I was changing, I would continue. And I don't think I would have had that attitude without that happening to me. Because I think I would have continued going through life as a teenager and as a pretty rebellious, angry teenager. And it definitely woke me up to the fact that there's plenty of people out there and plenty of things that know a lot more than I do. And for that, I'm eternally grateful to God for giving me that awakening.
It's amazing. Thank you so much. Those of us who know Susan well know that she is among the most spiritual people that we've ever met. Every conversation, every interaction, like your late husband, includes thank God, with God's help, Baruch Hashem, and even just listening to you tell that story without bitterness or anger, but with seeing Hashem's guiding hand, is, I think, something that probably amazes all of us. So I want to ask you the obvious question that's probably on all of our minds. So many in this room have gone through infinitely less struggles, infinitely less challenges. I always like to joke that there are people who stub their toe and say, that hurt, there's no God, I stubbed my toe, there can't be a God, why would he make bad things happen to me? And look what you went through, and you see and you feel God's guiding hands in your life. Where does that come from? And how can you make it contagious? And how can we get a taste of it? How can you inspire us to see more of God's goodness and graciousness, to live life with faith and absolute knowledge that He's there, to feel even in the darkest moments that all that God has is somehow for our good? Where do you find the strength? Where did you and do you find the strength to live that way? And how would you encourage others who are going through hard times to draw strength in that way as well?
Again, I was very blessed and fortunate to live with somebody who infused a lot of this into our daily lives. But I really think it's a choice. I think, you have to open your eyes and see all the blessings that we have each day. It's there in front of us. You just have to open your eyes. It started, I feel like my skills were sharpened after this happened. I felt much closer to Hashem after this happened. It could go in the opposite direction too. My older son, is having a hard time believing in God and believing that, God doesn't take away, a father like this. But all my other children really see it. And, I'll give you just the first example that comes to my head. Like a couple of days after he died, we were sitting in the house and my younger son came in and said, "Mommy, I just had a dream. Abba came to my dream and he hugged me and he said he loved me and he would always be with me." And I said, "That's nice, And then maybe 10 minutes later, my other son came in the room and said the exact same dream. They hadn't spoken to each other. And when you start to open your eyes, you see things like this each and every day. And I can give you an example of something that happened just very recently. And I knew my other son would come around. He actually went to Israel this summer on an NCSY trip. And I really wanted them to go visit the grave. And they had one weekend off. And it was either they see the family in Israel or they go to the grave. And I said, what would Obadi want? See the family. But I knew deep down it was important that they would get to the grave and say Tehillim. And they gave me the name of the person that was running the program. And I reached out to him, and sure enough, he was somebody who, the name looked familiar. He lived across the street from me 15 years ago. So I felt again very strong Hashem. Like I looked up and I smiled, like, okay, thank you. Like I knew that this was coming from Hashem. And I always felt like Obadi was whispering in Hashem's ear. And so then my sister-in-law calls me and says, "We can't get to the grave. They're doing so much construction. There's no way, nobody's picking up the phone at Har Menachot. What are we going to do?" Rabbi Yudin said to me, "Don't worry, we're going to get them to the grave." They went the first time, they couldn't get to the grave. They couldn't find the plot. They're doing all this major stuff. He said, "Don't worry, we're going to go the last day before the boys leave Israel." And I just instinctually knew, everything was going to be okay. They were going to get there. They spent an hour looking for the grave. They couldn't find it. We all know Har Menachot, it's a pretty big cemetery. There wasn't any human beings around. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, a man appeared. And they said, "Oh, do you know where this plot grave is?" He said, "Yes. I was just at that grave right next to it. And my niece is married to a Mutzafi. Let me take you to the grave." And led them to the grave. So even my older son, who has difficulty sometimes believing in Hashem, I said, "How do you explain that word?" And he said, "Yeah, yes, So it's there if we open our eyes.
Amazing. Danielle, you must have had a lot of anger and a lot of resentment. The suicide bombers and those who did this to you, who gave you these injuries that you continue to feel pain from. How do you channel that? What do you do with that? You must have a feeling of a desire for revenge, but it's not a Jewish concept. So what did you do with those feelings?
One of the hardest things, besides for the physical injuries, to cope with is the mental anguish. Immediately following the Israeli government to, I think, all suicide bombing victims or terror victims alike, they provide, and actually require at least me to go to 3 therapy sessions to begin with, that they paid for and set up with. But like you said, there's a lot of anger. a lot of anger that we can't exactly express and can't exactly do anything about, because like you said, revenge is not a Jewish concept. We don't strap ourselves with explosives and go on their streets and blow up 8-month-old babies like they did. Rather, we try to figure out other ways. And what is a Jewish concept? What I did afterwards is I found out who was responsible for the attack and I sued. Channeled my true inner Judaism. And at these times, it's extremely important to know who was actually responsible for the attack. Hamas took credit for the attack, and members of Hamas did carry it out. However, I and other American victims proved in an American court irrefutably that the ones actually responsible for the attack was none other than the Islamic Republic of Iran, as they are behind every terrorist attack around the world, with high probability. Hamas went from a organization that was throwing cocktails to throwing stones at soldiers to having the sophistication to carry out triple suicide bombings on the street in Machane Yehuda and Ben Yehuda to avoid high Israeli security and to carry out very sophisticated types of attacks. And none of that would have been possible without the financial and the military support of Iran. When they were kicked out and sent to Lebanon, and this was testified by Hamas members themselves, that they were taught by Farsi-speaking Iranian soldiers on how to carry out these attacks. And the truth is, for Iran, it's a win-win situation because they hate Palestinians as much as we do. To them, Palestinians are, the cockroaches of the Arab world. And if they're going to go out and kill Jews and kill themselves at the same time, wow, what a success that is for Iran. And so they do that. They give hundreds of millions of dollars to Iran a year so they can carry out these attacks. To me, I know that the common conversation around the world is always money. Doesn't matter if you're a terrorist, it doesn't matter if you're Iran, it doesn't matter if you're here. Money always speaks. And so we went after their assets and we went after their money. To me, that's how I coped. I know that in my lawsuit, and I know that a few $1 million here and there to Iran, even $150 billion to Iran, is a drop in the bucket of a budget for a government. But for the first time ever in recorded history in any of these lawsuits, they came. In the original lawsuit, they didn't represent themselves. Forget the infidels. Those Americans, they don't treat us well. The courts are biased. We're not even going to show up. Okay? So then the judge awarded us, a couple $100 million in punitive damages and 85 in compensatory damages for all the American victims hurt. They still don't show up. But then we went after their assets that they don't have in the United States, quote unquote. Then they started to show up. They started to pay high-priced attorneys. They started to pay money. I know from inside sources that it affects them. It affects them to the citizens of Iran, to how they're portrayed in the world, and it affects them on their daily life. People are dealing with their lawsuits and dealing with it on a daily basis. So to me, to see the people that are responsible for the attack, we have a case right now in front of the Supreme Court of the United States. So I went all the way from Ben Yehuda to First Street in Washington. That the justices of the United States have to now talk about me, talk about my injuries, talk about my terror attack, and Iran has to do the same. And to me, that was the greatest type of revenge I could possibly take, because if they do lose $5 million, if they do lose $100 million, if they do lose $2 billion like they're going to lose, or if they do lose $1 billion building in Manhattan that was recently grabbed from them in the largest terrorist grab ever in history, If they do lose that and they hesitate one more moment to give Hamas money, because it's not just $1 million, it's not just the $5 million, but it's the $100 millions that they might lose now. If that saves one life and that saves one person and stops one attack, then everything is worth it.
Can I pause here? Susan, you were describing how you turned yourself around. That comment from your daughter really gave you kind of the kick you needed to turn around. And those of us who know you since you moved to Florida only see the positive and warm and happy person that I think has enabled you to be able to move forward in life and meet someone new and build your beautiful life again. But maybe you could share with us, as you went through this tragedy, as you went through this life-changing event, which wasn't a gradual decline because of illness, but in a moment, your life changed in a moment. What were the things that people did that were helpful, and what were the things that people did that were unhelpful, if not painful? Were there things people did to reach out that gave you and your family support and guidance that really helped you be able to arrive at this day in which you're able to speak with such faith and optimism? And what can we learn from the things that people did in either direction? Maybe the mistakes, people who were trying to be helpful but it turned out weren't so much. What can we learn from them?
After it happened, I was like in a complete state of panic and fear, worrying about finances, what's going to happen. And, the community really rallied around me. Project Ezra came in, and there was a Raton in Inglewood that I just really connected with, and she just sort of took my family in and always made sure I had whatever I needed. I think I needed several months to just kind of like, everything's going to be okay, don't worry, don't panic. So the community just helped me so much. I really can't think of anything bad, that just everybody was amazing. And, my friends were my family. And we had, people, my friends would come, some would sleep with me at night. Food being brought to us, whatever my kids needed. People driving my kids coming to help my kids with homework every single day. Just so much support. Every Shabbos we were invited to places. We weren't alone. Every Friday, different men would come pick up my boys, take them to shul. So living in a community like this is really unbelievable, the amount of support you have. I don't know how I could have gotten through it without everyone's help and just taking my panic and my fears and, putting it to rest. It was my very good friend who sat with me. I think it was, several months had passed, and, I think it was my son who said, Mommy, you can keep crying, but you need to move on. Abba would want you to move forward. And I came from such, I had a beautiful marriage, and, I only knew how to be a wife and be a mother. This whole experience about being on my own was, it just felt off for me, and I just wanted to pull our lives back together. And I remember sitting in my good friend's kitchen, and she said, we're going to pray right now. We're going to pray for you to find somebody. And that would have sounded absolutely insane because it was maybe, 6 months after my husband passed. But anyone who knew us, and understood what we had, and we knew what we wanted and what I wanted, and my friends would say to me, my close friends that really knew me, saying, you can cry from today till tomorrow. He's not coming back. And you need to move forward. You need to build a life for you and your children again. And I said, okay. And we actually remember sitting in our kitchen, praying to find my B'Sher. And literally a month later, I did.
I have a lot more questions, but it's a community conversation, so I want to open it up from the floor. If you have a question, feel free to share with either of our panelists. I'll repeat the question so everyone can hear. So either for Susan or Danielle. Questions?
What brought you to Boca?
Question was, what brought you to Boca?
This is again where I really look at how you see Hashem's hand. Okay, so when I lived in Teaneck, no matter what I did, everyone would look at me, hi, you okay? How are you? That's not who I was, and so Hashem, I really felt like knew that I needed to start somewhere fresh. And the person that I had met online, I decided to sign up for J-Day. And one night I was on and I saw this handsome man and I just kind of favorited him and he wrote me back and I said on my profile, I had all my children on the profile with me. I said I was looking for somebody who's, Shom Shabbat, who, keeps kosher, who does, I was looking, I put all these words in and my new husband didn't understand what any of that meant. He just was like, oh. So I explained to him. And what he saw in me, which he didn't see in many of the women that were from Palm Beach, I was very family-oriented, very dedicated, and he said, through everything you've been through, I just see so much positive in you. And we were talking for about 3 weeks, and he decided to come out and visit me. And he was supposed to stay for 24 hours. He stayed for 3 days, and he asked me to marry him on our second night of our first date. That's what brought me to Boca.
And he's a great guy, a good ball player, and an amazing doctor. I know first day I left working with him. Okay, what other questions do we have? Other questions? Other questions? Yeah.
Susan, you described your initial despair and how difficult it was to rise out of it. I didn't know your husband, but I was at the Shloshim. And I want everybody to know that it was the most inspiring and beautiful event, and how you had the strength, the courage to stand up and talk about your husband with such love and admiration, with faith in him and faith in God and the commitment. It was full of Torah by you and the people you chose. And my question, first of all, I want everybody to know that you were not, if you were in despair and you were vulnerable, you certainly rose for that occasion to inspire the entire community and a show full of people. And perhaps share with us what inspired you and how you had that courage and strength and how you chose to speak the way you did.
I wanted to honor him. I just felt he deserved to be honored like a king. And so many of you know Rabbi Mansour, who also spoke at the Shloshim, and nobody knew how to get him over to that day as well. But again, I believe I just knew it. I felt this urge and my husband loved Rabbi Mansour. That was his favorite rabbi. So I felt that people needed to know who he was, what he stood for, what we had, and he just needed to be honored. And that was what was the most important thing to me, more important than anything.
Danielle, tell us about the injuries and some of the miracles in which God has allowed you to overcome them.
Well, first of all, to be sandwiched between two suicide bombers that are only 5 to 6 feet. I'm talking about, before those chairs, is a miracle that you're even alive. First of all, but the fact that you walk away with no noticeable outward injuries is a miracle in itself. I mentioned that I was making a toast when the suicide bombing went off. First of all, I'm right-handed. I never really use my left hand to hold a glass or for any reason. But that day I was distracted, looking for some friends, honestly looking for a girlfriend of mine that was going to walk around Ben Yehuda. And I grabbed the glass because I was distracted. I grabbed it with the hand that was closest to the glass, which was my left hand. And as we made the toast, my hand was lifted, and I had a piece of shrapnel enter my left arm. I now suffer from nerve damage in that arm, and even if I do physical routine activity, such as typing, The arm will go dead within a few minutes. I'll have to stretch it out and sometimes ice it just to get strength back in it. But it stopped the shrapnel from going into my chest. And it blocked it from entering my heart, my lungs, any one of my vital organs. So I truly believe that grabbing that glass with my left hand probably saved my life. The bomber was sitting at the table next to us, having his last cigarette. And a woman came up to him and asked him to stop smoking and blowing smoke while she's trying to eat. And so he decided to grab her by the arm and pull her with him. So when he blew up, he at least knew he was going to kill one person. She happened to be a black belt in karate and broke out of his grasp. A boy by the name of Uri Kushalevi, 20 years old, who was working in the local store in Ben Yehuda to support his family. Not his children, his brothers and sisters and his parents. Saw the woman being assaulted and came out and stood in between her and the bomber. And the bomber took his life. And he took the brunt of the attack because he was right next to the bomber when he exploded. I know that he saved that woman's life, but I'm pretty sure he also saved mine and my friends, because he took most of the shrapnel and a lot of the blast and the fire that comes out of the attack. My hair was completely singed from the fire from the attack. So you could imagine if no one was standing in front of him or no one was blocking it, what could have happened. The piece of glass that went into my eye, when the doctor came to see it, he was a Chiloni Jew, admittedly to me, did not believe in God. And he took one look at my eye and it immediately said that there's no explanation in the world that could explain it except for God. And from then on, he believed in God. As he said, the piece of glass and the angle that it went in should have continued all the way to the back of my eye and blinded me, God forbid. But for some reason, it went into my eye, into the first layer, and then just dropped into the hole and just stayed there. And he had no way of explaining it. He even called over 5 or 6 or 10 other doctors until I finally stopped him from prodding my eye to confirm it. I came back to America, and an American doctor confirmed the same diagnosis. As I said, my friend had a piece of shrapnel on the wall of his heart. I mean, you can't imagine a milli-inch it would move over. They were doing a test in the hospital, and they immediately came running in to stop the test because they were afraid that it would just move it just an inch and it would be killed. His parents came to Israel and handed that doctor a $50,000 check to the chiropractor and said, "Save my kid's life." My friend had shrapnel in the back of his head. I can go on and on for tens of miracles of the way shrapnel bounces, but over 184, but I do like to say 184 people were injured that day. 184, including an 8-month-old baby, and 5 were killed. And I don't want to end this night without mentioning them, the 5 that were killed that day that weren't as lucky. 3 of them were 14-year-old girls. Smadara Hanan and Sivan Zarkar were best friends, shopping for school supplies on the first week of school, and were immediately killed by the bomber. As I mentioned, Uri Kushalevi was 20 years old. Yael Batwin's family had just moved to Israel 3 years earlier and made Aliyah from America. She was also 14 years old. And then Yehuda Markowitz was 40. So we always have to remember the 5 that were killed and the 5 that were not as lucky as I was or my friends were. And to always keep in mind that when you go into Selichot tonight and you're trying to find feeling and you're trying to find something to grab onto, something to uplift you, is that we stand right now at a very, very treacherous time. And I don't know about you, but I feel this year like the weight of the world is on my shoulders, on all of our shoulders. And we're standing at a time that I see the signs around the shul, to lobby your members of Congress and something to help us. But tonight is not about lobbying your members of Congress. It's not about writing them reports. It's, not to sound cheesy, it's about lobbying God. That as much as the vote seems to be going one way or another, we still have God and we still have Hashem, and we still can pray to Him and lobby Him. And just as my life changed in one blink of an eye and in 1 second, I went from nowhere in life to meeting my best friend in Israel, who is now my rabbi, and who is now, we speak every single day and gives me inspiration every day, that we could still change that and still do that. So remember all of the terror victims that were not as lucky, and all of the injured that still suffer from horrible injuries to this day, and just pray that we can do something to stop.
Michael.
It's for Danielle. Danielle, all these years I've known you, I've never known this about you. So it's incredible, your story. But I remember many years when your father was giving his Russia the day before his open heart surgery. You spoke incredibly passionately, too. And so I'm wondering the time from high school to that point, what happened that you left the rebelliousness and came back into the fold? What outside of the incident, what took place to bring you back?
So just to paraphrase Michael's question, what can parents do to invite their children back? How can parents best behave to create a scenario where their children will want to reestablish relationships, reestablish a similar religious vision? What is the best thing for parents to do?
Well, I'm the last person to tell any parent what to do. Every situation is different. But I will tell you about that open heart surgery, probably my fault. That I had that surgery. He wrote that in a letter to me, actually. I'm just kidding. But to answer your question, what happened is very simple. And right now, my relationship with my parents is better than, I could ever imagine. I run my mother's company. I speak to her at least 6 times a day. Father, not as much, but my mom, yeah. But our relationship is incredible. And the reason our relationship is incredible is very simple. And it took me a while to realize it. And it took me a while to realize why they sent me to Israel with $200 in my pocket and no one to talk to and no one to call. It's because they made the best decision that any parent could ever make in the world. And I tell them to this very day that I would not, if I could go back, I would ask them to do it again. And that is that they stayed out of it. They said, and I realized later that this was all part of the idea and part of the plan was, that I should find it on my own. That their intervention and their talking to me was only going to make things worse because of parents and children, will have a certain type of relationship and we'll always go back to that immature teenage relationship with our parents no matter how old and how forward we become. It's just part of, I think, natural way of being with parents. So the fact that they let me go and let me be led me to the people that I wanted to meet. The first year I was there, it was all about getting better. It was all about physical. It was all about mental. It was all about trying to recover from the attack. But the second year, I went and I was going to go to this rabbi who, I didn't know. He was a couple years older than me. And I said that I would listen to everything he said, no matter what he told me to do. To be honest, I was dating a girl at the time that God himself could have come down and told me to break up with her and I wouldn't have done it. My parents, because my parents wanted me, my parents wanted me to break up with her, so I wasn't going to break up with her, no matter what. But I said that whatever this rabbi says, I'm going to do it. It's just plain and simple. And within 3 days, he told me, break up with the girl. And I did it. And that one thing led to another, that led to another, led to another, and I was able to see Judaism and I was able to see Torah and God totally anew and totally afresh and totally in a new perspective that my parents probably could have never given me, not because they're not good parents or they're not good teachers. My father is the best teacher that I know, but just because. And because of that, I was able to turn around.
This has been an amazing conversation. We're all deeply grateful. As I said at the outset, these were difficult stories to share, but highly personal, and we are all enriched and inspired and better off for your having opened up to us. So we're deeply grateful. Thank you for sharing your stories and for answering our questions. I want to invite everyone in a few minutes in the Rand Sanctuary. We'll have a film as part of our film series, and Rabbi Benavicki will be giving an advanced Chabura for men at the same time in the Center's library. 12:15 we'll have our kumsitz. We have a lot of wonderful musicians coming, and a beautiful kumsitz, and we'll begin Selichot at approximately 1 a.m. So thank you all very much.